Okay, should we talk a little bit about breastfeeding?
Of course.
Of course. So this will seem like a totally different thing. The final corrective lens of this chapter is actually about it, and I wasn't going to talk about it, but then I was reading the New York Times.
Oh no.
I know. I was reading the New York Times, the Sunday paper, and we still get it. We still get it in hard copy. Last week, August 1st, and I came across this full-page ad, which I'm just going to show you briefly, and then I'm going to read it. Okay, so this, yeah. How is breastfeeding going? It says, except breast is crossed out. It's crossed out, and then it's got 4 testimonials, brief one-word testimonials. Someone named Leslie Ann says, "Don't assume my breasts can make milk." Someone who is Tian France, I guess, a gay man, says, "Don't assume I want to feed my baby donor breast milk." An entrepreneur named Hannah says, "Don't assume I can do it all." And a philanthropist named Kelly says, "Don't assume breast was best for my entire family." The rest of the ad reads, "Nearly 75% of U.S. parents will turn to formula within the first 6 months. So why are we ashamed to talk about it? It's time to evolve the conversation. We'll start." So I obviously pulled this from the paper and saved it, and I then went to the site, being somewhat horrified by this full-page ad in the front section of the New York Times. And I find this. This is howisfeedinggoing.com. "We're starting a movement. It's time to evolve the conversation around how we feed our babies. Make the commitment." And it says, "I commit to evolving the conversation around how we feed our babies by asking a new question. How is feeding going? Your commitment will further help Bobby shake the stigma on formula feeding. Every committed voice helps reduce another parent's guilt." So you can take my screen off here. First of all, guilt, like anxiety, like depression, like grief, is appropriate in some circumstances and not in others. Same thing with stigma. Some stigmas exist for a good reason. It turns out that this entire thing, and I'm going to try not to swear here, even though I don't always try not to swear, it's a formula company.
Of course.
This is an advertisement. The whole thing is an advertisement for a formula company, and it's reprehensible and confused, and unlike your helmet, another horseman of the apocalypse. And it comes in this like woman-friendly, family-friendly guise. It's a couple of women who really felt that they needed to create this formula company, but it's manipulative and greed-driven, and yes, I think another existential threat. So I'm going to read this last corrective lens for this chapter and then go to one of the papers. So when I'm reading excerpts, I'm not reading the footnotes, obviously, but this book is very well referenced. We've got a lot of primary literature and other literature in it. I'm going to go to one of the papers that this corrective lens paper cites, this corrective lens bullet point at the end of our chapter cites. "Breastfeed your infants if you can. Adults who are breastfed have better formed palates and better aligned teeth compared to those who are bottle fed. And breast milk has in it all manner of nutrients and information that we do not understand. It may, for instance, contain cues with which the infant entrains his sleep-wake cycle. Thus, if you do breastfeed and also pump milk to feed the babies at other times, feeding your baby milk that was pumped at the same time of day as it currently is could be helpful in getting your baby to sleep when you want him to. Put another way, beware Chesterton's breast milk." So before we go to the literature, I just want to say with regard to that hypothesis in the second half here, the idea that there may actually be like circadian cues in the breast milk, which may help entrain the sleep-wake cycle of the baby, is a hypothesis put forth by a former student of ours, Josie Jarvis. And I actually approached her when writing this and said, have you published anything? Do you have anything? And what we have is the paper that she wrote for us in the program, in which she described a considerable amount of evidence in support of the hypothesis, but still not directly tested. But it points again to the idea that simply if you really do recognize and believe and recognize the facts that breast milk is best for your child through some age, and what age that is varies widely between cultures. then it is, and therefore you are interested in pumping milk in order to give your child that milk when you can't be there for him or her. It actually makes sense, and we hadn't thought about this, so this was not something that we did for our own children, but to actually keep track of the time of day when you express the milk, because sending a child who wakes in the middle of the night, if it's your partner who's getting up to feed them, for instance, giving them milk that was expressed midday may in fact wake the child up more. And again, this is a hypothesis that has not been tested, but given how much immunological and endocrinological material there is in breast milk, it almost seems to me, once Josie proposed this to us, I felt like, it's like so many of the best evolutionary hypotheses, obvious in retrospect, which was almost the name of our book, right? Obvious in retrospect.
Highly likely to be true. And, and also this is the perfect demonstration that it's not like paleo everything, right?
Right.
There is a role for pumping breast milk, and modern society and the way we relate to work makes it useful. But the point is there's a ham-fisted way of doing it in which you assume that all this is food.
Yep.
Right. And then there's a way that understands that actually this is a complex mechanism through which mothers have been communicating with babies in a way neither of them understands for, I guess, almost 100 million years. No, not quite. But nonetheless, I mean, it's a
I missed the mammals.
Yeah.
Mammals is probably closer to 200 million.
200 million. All right.
Yeah. Well older than Chicxulub impact. But 100 to 200 million.
100 to 200 million. Yeah. Okay. So in any case, the point is this is a complex phenomenon, and is there room to disturb it? Yeah, you may even have to disturb it, and not everybody can breastfeed. But the idea that we're going to pretend that promoting breastfeeding is a bad thing because it's insensitive to somebody who can't do it, that's preposterous.
And the fact that a majority of mothers currently feed their kids some formula, and therefore we need to normalize it and destigmatize it, that's no argument.
It's not.
That's
it's circular.
No argument at all.
Right.
It's quite appalling.
And the issue of palate, actually, I want to return to that one.
And so this actually, let me just read the introduction of this paper, because this is actually the paper about palate. This is by actually a dentist at DDS, Brian Palmer, from 1998, called The Influence of Breastfeeding on the Development of the Oral Cavity, a commentary. So the short introduction simply reads, and you can show my screen if you want, Zach, although you don't have to. Conventional wisdom, supported by scientific research, advocates breastfeeding as the superior method of infant feeding. The nutritional, immunological, psychological, and general health advantages conveyed to infants have been documented for years. And then he has 9 citations. Legovich listed the merits of human breast milk as compared to artificial feeds to include ideal nutritional content, better absorption, fewer food-related allergies, more favorable psychological development, better immunologic defenses, and a substantial economic advantage. There is another compelling benefit to exclusive breastfeeding: positive effects on the development of an infant's oral cavity, including improved shaping of the hard palate resulting in proper alignment of teeth and fewer problems with malocclusions. The purpose of this commentary is to stimulate further research as well as to propose the importance of breastfeeding to developing and maintaining the physiologic integrity of the oral cavity. And then he's just got a ton of evidence in here about, and including from historic, from basically skull collections from both modern and historic peoples. And yes, some of that's going to be diet, as we've talked about before, as you talked about with Mike Mew in summer of 2020. But the idea here is that, in part, basically the way that the tongue and the jaw are held during breastfeeding as opposed to with an artificial nipple are so different that you end up with things like tongue thrust in bottle-fed kids, and that you don't in breastfed kids, and that those things, those misalignments, those malocclusions, tongue thrust and such, persist into adulthood.
Right. And result in a tremendous amount of orthodontia, which is itself destructive, as I learned all too painfully.
Right.
But anyway, to connect this up with the Mike Mew stuff, right? Mike does a great job of laying out the evidence that suggests that all of this tooth alignment stuff is likely to be downstream of changes in diet and, behavior. and not the result, as the entire field of orthodontia, of orthodontists has it, that it's some sort of mystical, mysterious failure of genes, which couldn't possibly be the answer.
Our genes just got really bad.
Really bad, really quick. And the point is, the evidence from other creatures, from ancestral populations, all suggest something very different. And, that it isn't one thing. You've got breastfeeding, you've got, the chewing, the gnawing on harder foods by very young children early on.
Which is good for jaw development.
Good for jaw development. And the point is, it results in a mouth shape that is proper and that prevents all of these other things. It's not just your teeth alignment. It's, whether or not you have things like sleep apnea. And
well, exactly. Nasal cavity development, even I think is some evidence for soft tissue in the esophagus development.
Right. So anyway, it's the same story again and again. We have some foolish, simplistic medical explanation for why there's so much dysfunction in the world, when really the answer is many, many variations on the same theme, which is somewhere along the line we disrupted something that was important that we didn't understand the function of, and we never got around to saying, hey, maybe that was a mistake, right? And so you're watching that mistake be amplified with sophisticated advertising, with a full page ad in the New York Times. And, that's not to say it's not an appropriate remedy if you can't breastfeed your child, but breastfeeding is simply superior.
And I mean, I think one of the errors here is, and I guess I alluded to this already, is, excuse me, the idea that if something has been stigmatized, we, as fully sophisticated modern people, should recognize that that's regressive and archaic, and we need to abolish the stigma. And no, right? Like, some things that have been stigmatized should still be stigmatized. To use the example I gave last week, pedophilia, like, that needs to remain stigmatized. And, all of it, all of the horrible things that I could list here, right? Like, they need to stay stigmatized. Rape and incest and murder, and like, these things need to stay stigmatized. And the idea, therefore, that something that was stigmatized needs to come out into the light, like, it's a borrowing of the successes of civil rights, frankly, and women's rights, and we're seeing it across the board. The idea that we lived in a much more racist society in the past, and most of us have seen the errors of our ways, and so have we society-wide, and we can therefore look back on that and see how bad it was. Well, now people are taking that overlay and applying it to things to which it does not belong. Yeah.
Another way to say this is that many things like stigma are named after the malignant version of something functional.
Yeah.
And so we tend to get the sense that everything that looks like that is bad, when in fact, no, there's a category where you've got some adaptive, guilt, for example, right? Guilt has a bad rap, but it shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
Guilt is one of the things that causes us to self-regulate. And there's a point at which you're feeling too much guilt to be adaptive, where it becomes maladaptive, at which point we start noticing it. And that's not the way it should work. So if we can divide, all of these things into, to what degree has it been useful? To what degree was it adaptive? To what degree is it still adaptive? And when have you gone beyond what is adaptive? When is it a pathological version of the thing? It's a much healthier way of viewing it, rather than, stigma bad.
Right. It's a very binary approach to the world.
Yep.